Okay, welcome to Online Learning 4. So far we've gotten to grips with the terminology, why we talk about Hebrew Bible over Old Testament or vice versa. We've had a look at the story of the Old Testament, gotten to grips with the overall broad picture within which we're kind of examining texts. And we've kind of asked the question, who were the Israelites? And we've seen that they were a people that kind of had a progressive journey of realization as a people group. So the last thing for us to do is kind of ask the question, what kind of literature are we looking at? So that's what we're going to be looking at in this session. So interpreting and understanding the writings of the Old Testament will be more accessible if we take into account the type of literature that we're reading. And the story of the Old Testament is punctuated by other types of literature. So we've got history, which is the main type of narrative. And this is living memory in the sense that recalling the past often acts as a way of speaking to the present. And we'll hear more about that later. Second type is law. This is instructional, often woven into narrative, but it's written in a way that's supposed to kind of instruct the audience. And then finally, we've got prose, poetry, and wisdom. So the Psalms and the Song of Solomon are the most obvious examples here. And these are often rich in theology, but more personal than the narrative text. So they're not telling stories, but they're kind of singing or praying or lamenting. So really, we're dealing with different types of literature here, and it's going to be important that we read the literature critically and understand how to do that. So when approaching these texts, many of the introductions we come across will, as Coggins asserts, ask questions about how the book came to reach its present form, with detailed attention to possible sources, strata, genuine and non-genuine units, and the like. It's important to consider these elements, but to just focus on the possible answers to what lies behind the text will miss the presenting theology in the material as it is, which is the form that is read and used in faith groups today. Now we'll look at the potential sources for the text later in the module, so I don't really want to cover any of that here. But another core approach to the literature in the Hebrew Bible is to look to them as examples of masterful artistry that must represent reality purely because of how well they're written. That differs from sort of traditional biblical scholarship because there's no attempt to divide sections or ascertain historical accuracy. Instead, the texts are taken as they are, without concern for sort of the intention or position of the author. But in reality, it's important to try and draw those two approaches together. So for example, taking a purely literary approach makes God, or Yahweh, a problematic character that is, as Coggins puts it, as inconsistent or unpredictable as any of the human characters. However, taking only a historical critical approach might make it difficult to move beyond why God is presented in a particular way. So drawing together the how and the why of both approaches is going to help to give the most sort of complete picture of these texts. So having established some of the approaches and types of literature we're dealing with, there are some cautions that we need to make and be aware of. So first, we can't remove our own biases when we read a text. However we're approaching a text, we're naturally going to look for things that we expect to find in them. So being consciously aware of our own biases is going to help us to be aware of the things in the texts that we wouldn't otherwise pick up on. Ultimately, though, it's our own interpretation that's accessible to us. We are the ones piecing together the evidence and the sources, so it's our presentation of that that's going to be the visible thing in the end. We won't necessarily be able to find a sort of absolute certain this is the baseline of what the text means and says. Second, the authors of the texts may not have our same concerns. So the history we find is told by a particular group recalling and establishing their place in the world. And they're naturally going to do things like exaggerate victories and conquests, as all people do. You want to make it sound like it's more impressive than perhaps it was, so you bump up the numbers and all those kinds of things. Also, they were writing thousands of years ago, so they're going to interpret the world through that lens. So the Genesis creation poems are not intended as science like we know it. Their world was flat, and it lay between the heavens and the underworld. Ours is round, we can see it from space. So the thing here is that you need to let their worldviews speak for themselves, and if you do that, it's going to make it more possible to find the depth in them, because you won't be distracted by the detail. And finally, kind of another point I want to make is just that their stories are presented as theology. In light of all of the stuff I've just said, it's important to state that the Hebrew Bible is itself an interpretation. The narrative of the Hebrew Bible would have started life as dinner table tales, which grew and adapted to comfort, encourage, and challenge the ancient Israelites. So these are their interpretations of how God acted in their past, in the hope that the same will continue to happen as they move into their future. Questions of history, while interesting to us, will have been of secondary importance to them. And what's important, really, is the meaning and the message of the national heritage. So as we move to ask how the Hebrew Bible can be used in Christian mission, we'll find that our stories, interpreted in light of the action of God, act as a great source of encouragement and theology that's readily available to us at all times and puts us in line with the traditions of the biblical authors from ancient times. So that brings us to the end of the online learning for this module. I'm hoping that you now have a good grounding. You're at a level footing to come into the module ready to kind of dive into the detail, the complexity of the issues surrounding these texts. We're going to be looking at things like ritual, sacrifice, what it means to be human, how to die well, all these kinds of things. And we're going to piece it all together to say, okay, how does any of this help us to kind of improve our mission and tell our stories better? So I'll see you at the learning weekend. I hope that there's some useful stuff you can be doing between now and then. Thanks for joining me on these lectures.